So the book of Revelation, of course, I like to start with a map, which is a thing that I love. This, of course, is modern-day Turkey, but it is also Asia Minor, just to give you an idea of where we are. And I'll zoom in. This area right here is called Asia. And I've just kind of drawn it roughly on the map. That is a province in the Roman Empire. Usually when we say the word Asia, we think of everything from here over to China. And so we might call that East Asia or whatever. Southeast Asia, you know, when we were in the Vietnam War, it was Southeast Asia. When they use the word Asia, it's just this little area right here. And so that might be kind of confusing. Let's zoom in. Here are the 7 churches of Asia, and it's hard to pick out amongst the stuff. So I've put little yellow circles around them. The Lord is going to be seen as walking among these 7 churches. And in the same way, we can imagine the Lord as walking among the churches in Northwest Georgia. And Brother Michael in his sermons is doing lessons on those 7 churches of Asia. And you have to think, what would the Lord say to the church at Rome? To the church here at Oak Hill Church of Christ on the top of this hill, what would the Lord tell us? There's things we're doing right as every congregation that he spoke to, that there was a compliment, but then what? There's some things I have against you. And some things they were not doing right. And you have to think, what's Oak Hill? What are we overlooking? What are we not doing right? What can't we see? And that's a tough one, no doubt. And as elders, that's something we should be on guard for. But sometimes you're blind to what is right next to you. So that's a thing. And that's an application that we must apply to ourselves at all times. So if you look at Revelation 1:1, what are you going to see? Well, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants the things that must soon take place. Well, it is a revelation. The whole word of revelation is something revealed. It's something I'm going to show you. And it has become the opposite of something revealed. Revelation is a mystery book. Revelation is something that I can't understand it. I'm not even going to bother trying. I've been to homes of church members. They were weeping because they read Revelation and they were afraid. Man, I don't understand what's going on here. This is just crazy, and it had literally blown their mind. Is that what we want? Is that what the Lord intended? Well, no, I don't think so. It is a revelation, and that word in Greek is our word apocalypse. Well, that word has just changed 180 degrees. What's the apocalypse in today's culture? Well, it's the end of the world. It's just crazy, wild things. Anytime there's an earthquake, tornadoes, anytime there's tragedy, well, it's the apocalypse. Well, that is not what this word is. It's something revealed. And I'm going to say this probably 1,000 times this quarter. So here's the first time. The people that read it first understood it. And we're 2,000 years away from that. So we have a hard time. We have to really work at this to understand it, because it is so different from our way of thinking. Let's move on. So we've got special challenges, no doubt. What kind of special challenges? What is it that we have to understand? Well, it's not easy for us. The rest of the New Testament, you can pretty much read that and say, yeah, I got that. Even if there's a symbolic thing, when Jesus says, I'm the door, when I'm the gate, well, we can pretty much get that. He's not speaking literally there, of course. He's using that as a figure of speech. But when we get to Revelation, it is not given in the same way. So we have to work to understand it. It's not quite so obvious to us, all right? Here's the thing. Whatever we say about Revelation, it has to be meaningful to its first readers. And that's where so many people today get it wrong. If we look in Revelation and we see things about the Pope, we see things about Hitler, we see things about nuclear war, well, what would that mean to the first readers? That would mean nothing. That wouldn't help them at all. And so if you're reading the newspaper and interpreting Revelation, you're going the wrong way. And yeah, we read the newspaper and we see things, it's terrible. Every hurricane, every tragic event, yeah, it's terrible, but it's not Revelation, okay? That's just part of living in a fallen world. That's just because we're not living in the Garden of Eden as God planned in the first place. And so when you see tragedies, when you see catastrophes, just remember, well, God intended for us to be in the Garden of Eden. And I'll just give you my insight. I think the end, heaven, is going to be pretty much like the Garden of Eden. I'll just leave that for you to think about. And we see that in Revelation. So we saw it in Genesis, and we're going to see it in Revelation. But we have to look at what was their understanding. And of course they understood these things. We open up the newspaper, and I mentioned this during the apocalyptic literature lesson. You see a picture of a donkey and an elephant. Well, that's symbolic. And you see a donkey and an elephant fighting, man, you can understand that. Our political parties are going business as usual. That seems like that's all they do. And sometimes I'd rather them fight than actually do something, because when they do something, it's not good. There's your political commentary for the day. So you read through Revelation, you're going to see over 300 symbols in this book. Now, some of them are very obvious what it's talking about. In fact, a lot of them, it tells us what it's symbolic of. And some of them, we're not going to know. We're not going to know every little nitty-gritty detail. We're not going to understand every minutia. But here's the thing. We can read the end of the book, and we know God's going to win. And that's the end of the story. And that's what we can take out of it. Whatever else we understand from Revelation, we know God's going to win at the end. And, you're going to get to places. I was listening to Revelation being read on my way, and we had 7 woes, and we had 7 trumpets, and we had dragons and beasts and all this, and I thought, what have I gotten myself into? But at the end of the day, here's what we know. God is concerned about us just like he was those first century Christians. God is interested in our lives, the things we're going through. Revelation is ultimately a book of hope. And we know who's going to win. And on the last day of this class, whatever else we say, that's what we're going to say. We know who's in charge, who's going to win. And so that's where we are. Imagine 2,000 years from now, they come back and look at one of the headlines from today. And the headline reads, "Brave Sweep Giant Doubleheader." Well, you and I understand that. Are they thinking, Indians? Are they thinking a literal giant with two heads? We understand that. It's talking baseball. All right? Would they understand that 2,000 years from now when they don't even play baseball and they sure don't know what's a doubleheader? And so we understand that's symbolic language. And it fits in our culture. When they read about dragons and they read about all these crazy things in the book of Revelation, they understood it. Just like we understand baseball talk. Yesterday on Facebook, I was reading football talk a lot. And I didn't understand a lot of it because I'm not a football guy. They've got their own jargon, don't they? And I'm in this culture. I'm just not in the culture of football. I know how to play it, but I don't know all the jargons. All right, so there's that. There's the 300 symbols, no mistaking the message. God's way of truth and right will triumph over its foes. And it looks, you watch the news, you're going to think Satan's winning. Sometimes I read the news and I think, man, we are living in Sodom and Gomorrah. But you know what? God knows he's going to take care of it. At a certain point, we just have to trust God. And, we like things right close where we can control them and handle them. And, yeah, that's familiar. But at a certain point, just trust God. Just leave it in his hands. And that's hard for us, especially people that like control. They don't want to let go of control. Guess what? There's some things that's outside of my circle. I can't control. The joke is I bought a universal control and I was disappointed. It didn't control the universe. Guess what? I don't have that control. That's God's job. And he's got this. Okay, so whatever else we learn, that's where we are. Revelation becomes a ground for theological nonsense. You just open up any browser on the internet and look up Revelation. You're going to see everything. First of all, don't trust everything you read on the internet. Just because it's on there doesn't mean it's the right thing. You need to be healthily skeptical of everything. Even in the brotherhood, you need to read these things with a jaundiced eye, if you want to look at it that way. It's still up to us to determine what's right. The Bereans were more noble because they took what Paul said and they compared it to Scripture. And we need to do that today. What's the Bible say? And that's where we start and that's where we finish. So if you read it in Revelation and you read about Muhammad or Hitler or any other thing in isolation from its context. You're starting off wrong. Revelation is written to these 7 churches that we saw a minute ago, and they were undergoing a persecution. And we're going to be talking about that. But if you look in Revelation 6 and verse 10, those are the souls that have been martyred, and they are under the altar. They have been sacrificed. And they're crying out, "How long, O Lord, are you going to let this go on?" And those first Christians, they knew who was being martyred. Some of their friends, their family may have been martyred. These people may have lost their houses because of the persecution. And the ones that were still alive were still crying out, "How long is this going to go on?" And 6 times in Revelation. Look in Revelation 1:1, we read a minute ago. These are things that are going to take place soon. And, you know, people start talking to you about Revelation. Go back to the first verse. What's soon? And so their answer will be, well, to the Lord, 1,000 years is a day, and a day is 1,000 years, so soon could mean anything. Well, this wasn't written to the Lord. It was written to the 7 churches of Asia. What would they understand to be soon? 1,000 years from now? 2,000 years from now? That's not soon in anybody's book. And you know, I've talked with people and they're stumped by this. They don't know how that fits in with their interpretation. So here's the thing when we talk about biblical interpretation. If your interpretation doesn't match the plain speaking of the Bible, you don't twist the Bible to fit your interpretation. You fit your interpretation to fit the Bible. So soon, he says it in the first verses 2 times, and at the end. These are things that's going to happen soon. You need to fit your interpretation to fit that. It meant something to those first readers. Our lessons that we learn is just like any other lesson. What was the main principle here? And that's how we will understand that. We understand the Lord's interested in us. The Lord cares about what happens in our life, and we have hope. We don't despair. As you watch the news, you might despair. And if you're despairing, my advice is turn the news off. These people that have the news on all day, don't do that. It will depress you. If it's negative by nature. If everything's going fine, it doesn't make the news. All right. I get yapping sometimes. How long, O Lord? How long are you going to let this go? Here's the assurance that these things would be soon. Revelation is a prophecy. So what is prophecy? What were the prophets in the Old Testament? Well, part of what they did was tell the future. That's not all that they did. Most of the time, they're just revealing the will of God. Now, Revelation is a prophecy because it tells us that in verse 3. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and keep what is written in it, for the time is near. There it is again, it's near. So it is a prophecy. Well, a prophet not only tells the future, but it's telling the word of the Lord. And that's what most of the prophets' job was speaking the will of the Lord. So let's talk about authorship. Well, that one's not too hard for this book. If it was Hebrews, we could spend a long time and we still might not come to a real good conclusion. This time, the book tells us who's the author. Well, it's the Apostle John. All right, and he tells us that 3 different times. So he is very forthright there. Early church fathers attributed the book to John. Now, when we talk about these early church fathers, what are we talking about? Those are Christians from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. They're the early church fathers. Were they inspired? Well, they were not. But we can tell what was their understanding, what were they thinking. And so they are valuable in that way. So very early, the church fathers attributed the book to John. John is going to use the authority of an apostle. Sometimes you can't reason with a child. When they start asking why, and they love to ask why. And finally, you get to a point, because I'm your dad, okay? And you're going to do what I say because I'm the dad. And you can't reason with them. Well, guess what? Apostles, they used, they begged, they pleaded, and then after a while they commanded. Why? They had that authority from God. Jesus told his apostles, I'm going to give you authority. And John was there when Jesus said that. So they had the authority of an apostle. John was going to be in exile on the Isle of Patmos. If you look down in 1 and verse 9, he tells us that. And so it's just a small island, about 9 miles wide, in the Aegean Sea off the coast of Asia Minor, there in the province of Asia. It's just a rock of an island, and you can go there now. Tours go there and see where John wrote Revelation. Well, we don't know that. You can look at the traditional side of where John wrote Revelation. We don't know where he was sitting on the island. That's one of those crazy things. All right. So let's talk about John. Well, let me back up. There he is, about John. You think he's one of the apostles. Peter, James, and John, of course, were the inner circle. He was just there. He was a fisherman, and you can go back and see on the Sea of Galilee. It's a lake. It's really not that big. I always wondered if you could actually see across the Sea of Galilee at every point. Well, yeah, you can. And hot tempers. You remember James and John? What were they called by Jesus? Sons of thunder. This is the same John. Ready to call down fire from heaven and destroy these people. And so they were called sons of thunder. They were Peter, James, and John, the inner circle. Jesus loved John. In fact, John calls himself the apostle whom Jesus loved. And at the Last Supper, Peter says, who's Jesus talking about? And they were just kind of, when they were eating, they would lean on their left elbow, and they would eat with their right hand, never the left hand. And he would just kind of lean back and ask him as an aside, who are you talking about? He was there on Jesus' right hand. And Jesus is able to pass the morsel to Judas, who must have been on his left hand. Peter's across the table. Go back and think about that. So you got John, who was there at the cross. And he had seen Jesus crucified. All the others had left. John was there with Jesus during the trial. He was in the house of the high priest. He was known by them. This is the same John who, after 70 AD, a tradition says he had to flee Jerusalem, and he made his home base in Ephesus. And he was called one of the pillars of the church in Galatians. He was called a pillar of the church in Jerusalem. And now he's had to flee, and tradition says he's in Ephesus. So he would know people all in these areas, in these 7 churches. He's the one that wrote, of course, the Gospel of John and the epistles of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. The same guy. All right, there's the context of this guy. Let's talk about the date, and we could spend an hour talking about the date. We'll put it around 95 AD. Some want to put it before 70 AD, and they will say, well, that's because if it was after the temple had fallen, he surely would have mentioned that. Well, not necessarily. While that was a big event, that wasn't in the scope of what he's writing here. Christians were facing the grim ordeal of persecution. Now, there was a persecution earlier during the time of Nero. It was more localized around the city of Rome, not so much in Asia Minor. So, more widespread persecution would be during the reign of Domitian. And he was in the late 80s up until the late 90s. He was emperor. He was Caesar. It was more widespread, and we will talk about why that is, but they were facing this. Apocalyptic writing was used to hide the message. And we talked about this before. If you got a tough message that is going to give hope to your followers, you might not want the people persecuting you to understand it. Somebody that wasn't familiar with these 300 symbols, somebody that wasn't familiar with the Old Testament, they would not make any sense of this. It wouldn't mean anything to them. So that's why a general understanding of the Bible, a general understanding of these specific references helps when we go to interpret Revelation. Very often, and we said this before, very often the rabbi, the teacher, would just mention something happened. Meribah comes up a lot. Well, what happened there? Well, there was a rebellion. And there's a whole story there. But if the teacher just mentions Meribah, don't be like Meribah. The students would understand the whole story, and they would take the reference. And we read several things where Jude especially, he uses those references and moves on. And it's up to the reader to understand the reference. And that's where we are. So we're hiding the message. So Domitian, during his lifetime, expected people to call him God. Now, 100 years earlier, the first Caesar was called God after he passed, after he died. The Senate got together and said, you know what? This guy was a god. Now, that wasn't such a big thing to them because they had literally hundreds of gods, and they just expected God to be around every corner. Little gods, little letter G God, not the capital letter G, right? Which we reserve for the one true God. But they had, Zeus and Apollo and all the Greek, what we would call the Greek gods. They were real to them. In their mind, these were gods. Now, the Christians and the Jews, they say there's only one God. What's that mean? That means they don't think my God's true. You want to get somebody riled up, you tell them what they believe is false. What do we not talk about in social occasions? Religion and politics. Their politics was religion. You could hit both of those things when you say Zeus is not real. You're hitting religion and politics. Every Caesar had been declared to be God. Imagine during this time, what's a God? Somebody that's powerful. Somebody that can do whatever he wants. To these people, they might say, well, yeah, he's a God. And so by the time of Domitian, he says, you know what, if I'm going to be a God after I die, I must be a God now. And so he started expecting people to call him Lord and God. And he set up statues around the Roman Empire and expected people to worship him, just like they would any other god. In fact, before you could go buy food at the market every year, you had to go to the temple, the shrine of Domitian. Pinch some incense and put it on the altar and say, Dominus et Deus. Caesar is Lord. How would you as a Christian feel about that? Could you say Caesar is Lord? If you don't say it, you can't buy food at the market. How are you going to feed your kids? How are you going to take care of your family if you can't buy things at the market? But in order to buy things at the market, you've got to say Caesar is God. That's tough. How long, oh Lord, are you going to let this go on? Lord, do you know what's going on down here? And these people were having serious problems. If you don't do this, you could be killed. You could be ostracized. You could lose your possessions. And these Christians knew people that had happened. During COVID, when it first came, you remember that. I know somebody that's had COVID. I hear people are dying from it. Were we afraid? Yeah, it's an unknown thing. What did we do? Man, we shut down services. Why? We didn't know. We didn't want to lose half the congregation to some unknown disease. Should we have? I don't know. These people were undergoing a real persecution. They kept going on. And it's tough decisions. All right, I get thinking about it. Christians who refused to participate in this idolatry became liable to arrest, economic boycott, and even death. And yeah, we're going to talk about that. Caesar killed thousands of Christians. Caesar Nero in the 70s. And that was more localized, as we said. Domitian, this is going to raise it to another level and influence these people here in Asia Minor. So why were the early Christians hated by Roman society? Christians were said to be atheists, cannibals, pyromaniacs, and treasonous. Those are some pretty stiff charges. What's up with that? Atheist, why would they be called atheist? They didn't believe in the gods. You don't believe in Zeus? You must be an atheist. You don't believe in Mercury and Apollo? You don't believe in Poseidon? What's that storm in the sea if there's no Poseidon? Very obvious there must be a Poseidon. Somebody stirred up that water. That's proof, right? We know there's only one God, and none of those Greek gods are the one God. So we are exclusive. Oh, you think you're special. You just only have one God. I feel sorry for you. You only have one God. Oh, boy. Atheist cannibals, why? Because they eat flesh and drink blood. We eat flesh every Sunday. What's up with that? In the Lord's Supper. We understand it's symbolic. Some Christians today actually believe in transubstantiation. It's not in my notes. I'm just throwing that in for free. It actually becomes the body and the blood. We understand this is symbolic. They were called cannibals. They were called pyromaniacs. The world's going to end in fire. So Nero, during his time, when Rome was burning, he blamed it on the Christians. Well, they're just starting the end of the world early. Treasonous because they would not profess allegiance to Caesar as God. So they must be treasonous. Wow. At first, Christianity was thought to be a sect of the Jews. Now, the Jews had a deal with Rome. They said, we're not going to pray to Caesar, but we will pray for Caesar. Oh, all right, we'll let you be Jews. Did they really pray for Caesar? They probably prayed for him to die. You have to think that. Do we pray for the president, even if he's not our party? We should. All right, that's your political commentary. I get off on politics sometimes. After a while, Christianity became an illegal religion because the Romans even realized, no, that's not Jews. They're separate. The Jews hated them. The Romans hated them. All right. Christianity was an exclusive religion. Its members would not compromise. Christianity, they wouldn't join the Roman army. Now, you remember the Roman soldier that talked to John? Was he condemned for being a soldier? No, he just said, don't take more than what you should. He didn't condemn him for being a soldier. He condemned him for being dishonest. Christians were considered wild fanatics because of their dedication and enthusiasm. Christians interfered with the temporal interest of many Romans. They didn't support the shrines. They didn't help the temples. What's up with that? They're not good Romans. They wouldn't participate in emperor worship. So if you were in town and something bad happened to your town, well, it's because that group over there didn't worship Caesar. Look what happened. We had this tornado. We had this earthquake. And they would blame those outsiders. They would blame the Christians. Wow. Army lost? Well, it's because those Christians weren't praying for the army weren't praying for Caesar. So you've got that. I think John had lived through the persecution in Rome. He'd heard that Peter and Paul were martyred, and that's tradition. We don't know that. It's tradition. But they were martyred in Rome, and he would have heard about it. And now the persecution is here in Ephesus. What's John going to feel? How's he going to think? All right, what have I left out? Characteristics of an apocalypse, we'll just have to leave this. These 5 things fit Revelation as an apocalypse. These last 2 things really don't fit as an apocalypse. We do know who the author was, and it is not sealed. Usually an apocalypse would be sealed for later. That means, should I make it known now or should I not? So sometimes, well, this is what's going to happen, but don't tell anybody. So that is sealed. And so you're going to read about things being sealed or unsealed. That's what it's talking about. Should I make it known? Should I put it in the book? Or is it a secret that will be revealed later? So a scroll that's going to be sealed, we'll open that later. All right. The 4 different views of Revelation, we won't get into that. And a lot of how you interpret Revelation is going to be determined by your view. We're going to use a modified preterist view. The preterist says there was a background there, and it's going to be mostly of the struggle between Rome and the church, the Roman Empire and the church. All right, let's move on. The Revelation threefold message: comfort, exhortation, and warning. Again and again, we will come back to that. In the conclusion, God's people are assured of their ultimate triumph over every foe. God's going to win. Now, I usually am optimistic as how far I'm going to get. In fact, I brought my notes for the first chapter, just in case. I start off optimistic and I end up misty-optic. And we didn't get very far today, but your homework is to read the first, 3-4 chapters of Revelation. We will have to move quickly because I've only allotted 1 quarter for this class. So we're not going to be able to dissect every verse and use our sentence structure, but we will